right. Thank you, everyone who took the time today to join us for the presentation. This will be on no-rise analyses in areas with 2D mapping, and it can tie into an area that's got regulatory 1D that you're replacing with a study that's 2D or just a study that's 2D. So the intro slide today are goals for what I'm hoping everyone will get out of this, and hopefully this is what you're here for. We will first go through an overview of the regulations and rules for floodways. A lot of people are going to know these, they haven't changed, but I always feel like it's important context when we're talking about anything like this to go through why we're talking about it. We'll summarize the requirements for a no-rise, which again, everyone is familiar with. It's not changed, but it kind of builds into what we're talking about in bullets 3 and 4, where we'll first highlight the differences between traditional 1D floodway studies and 2D floodway studies because they are quite different. And then we'll outline the process for determining a no-rise in a 2D study area. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to start with is what is a floodway? There are two definitions that I've included. I'm not going to read them to you, but there is a definition from 44 CFR 59.1 and the Nebraska State Statute 31-1008. The definitions are slightly different in wording, but they are the same in meaning. The floodway is really just the part of a river or waterway that we want to reserve for the base flood to convey without increasing the elevation of the 1% annual chance flood more than a foot. And the federal and state standards are 1 foot, but do be aware if you are working for a consulting firm or working for an agency that's working with many different jurisdictions, that local jurisdictions or other states also have the option to adopt and enforce higher standards. So there are jurisdictions that have a 1/2 foot limit on a floodway, and there are some that don't allow for any rise at all in that floodway, which is essentially just saying that your 1% annual chance floodplain boundary is your floodway. So in this graphic, the floodway is the pinkish color in the middle, and then the blue area would be your flood fringe, and your gold brown color is your 0.2%. And you can see that it's usually surrounding, the floodway is usually surrounding the channel area. You can see the blue line that's showing the flow line of this channel. It's a regulatory measure to assist communities with maintaining that river corridor. And it is not necessarily a topographic feature. So if you go out to a site, it's not like there's going to be some landmark that's going to show you where a floodway is. Yes, you can generally see where water is flowing, and yes, you're generally going to define a floodway to be in the area that water is most likely to flow. But it's not like there's some elevation difference that makes that the floodway boundary. There's quite a bit of wiggle room in how you can define that boundary. Okay, so if we were to cut a cross section across a floodplain, this is what we would be looking at. The normal channel would be where your base flow is. So if you went out to a bridge today where there's water flowing, this would be our normal channel. The dashed line that's showing the base flood elevation, that's your 1% annual chance floodplain, often referred to as the 100-year floodplain. And that is the regulatory floodplain. So that's where we're basing all of our analyses on. And then the floodway is an area that we encroach in. So we're pinching off the sides of that floodplain to delineate the floodway boundary without increasing the elevation of the 1% by more than 1 foot. So in the flood fringe, if you were to fill in all of the base flood elevation area within the two sides, that would be your floodway. So essentially it's allowing for communities to regulate development without having to do a no-rise in the flood fringe areas. So some development can occur without having to go through this process. But anything that happens then within that floodway has higher, stricter standards that need to be followed. All right. So the floodway regulatory requirements are the next things that we're going to talk through. 44 CFR 60.3 D3. And if you're not familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations, Chapter 60 is the one that we work in the most frequently, but this is the definition of what needs to happen in floodways. So the community or state, whatever entity you're representing, has to prohibit encroachments, including fill, new construction, substantial improvements, and other development within the adopted regulatory floodway unless it's been demonstrated that through an analysis with standard engineering practice that the proposed encroachment would not result in any increase in flood levels within the community during the occurrence of the base flood discharge. So I'll read that one to you. The next one is our state floodway regulatory definition. And really, again, the language is a little bit different. They're roughly the same, but the main difference being that in our state minimum standards and the state code, it's any increase in the water surface elevations along the floodway profile during the occurrence of the base flood. So it's slightly different. Some people say that this is a higher standard. I've yet to see an instance where the floodway profile and the base flood profile have been different, but I suppose someday maybe I'll be surprised and we'll understand why they're calling it a higher standard. When and why you need a no rise. So this is a pretty common question that we get, or something that can be easily missed in situations where something minor is happening within a floodway. So a no-rise analysis is required anytime work is being completed within that floodway. It doesn't matter what type of work, it doesn't matter the size of the project, even simple repair projects require a no-rise certification to be submitted with the floodplain development permit. Now, does this mean that you have to do a model and go through that whole process? No, it does not. But you do have to have an engineer that looks at the project, makes sure that there isn't going to be any issue, and they sign off on that floodplain cert. When I was in the private sector, I had to do a no-rise certification on paint striping. So even something like that, depending on where the funding is coming for the project, it might be a requirement. It was pretty easy as an engineer to sign off that paint striping wasn't going to cause any rise. So no, I did not have to do any modeling, but I did still have to submit that no-rise certification with the project documents. So just keep that in mind. Anytime you're working in a floodway, you should probably be prepared to have an engineer sign off on a no-rise certification to get your project permitted. Why do we require a no-rise analysis? This is a pretty time-consuming process, so it's important to understand why we have to do it. Obviously, we've gone through the different regulations. The Code of Federal Regulations requires it, our Nebraska state statutes, and the Administrative Code Title 455, which is our state minimum standards, requires it, and your local floodplain management ordinance requires it, because they are all built upon each other. So the federal regulations are defined and the state can adopt those or exceed those, which we have higher standards. So we have adopted higher standards from the federal regulations, but the same can happen at the local level. So the local ordinance can have higher standards than the state. So make sure that if you're doing a no-rise, you are talking to your local floodplain administrator to make sure that you're following the rules for their jurisdiction, because they can be different. And these procedures have to be enforced to maintain a community's status in the National Flood Insurance Program. And this is really important for especially property owners, because if a community loses that status, those people potentially lose their federally backed flood insurance. Could they pick up flood insurance on the private market? Yes, but that isn't as safe of an option. It's not guaranteed. It's not backed by the federal government. And the National Flood Insurance Program exists because we, as floodplain management experts, want to protect communities, want communities to be more resilient. We want to make sure that communities can maintain and protect the health and well-being of their residents. All right, now we're going to get into the rules of a no rise. And again, these aren't going to be different. It's just going to summarize kind of the steps that we go through as we're conducting the analysis. So when you are in a scenario that you have to do hydraulic analyses, so it's not a simple paint striping project, that has to be performed in accordance with standard engineering practices. That is typically going to be in a HECRAS model. In the MT2 revision request submittal checklist, it identifies the base or 1% annual chance flood elevation increases greater than 0.00 foot as a result of the encroachment within a floodway would require a conditional letter of map revision. And I put this in there because when I did this presentation the very first time at then DNR, someone asked me why it was 0.00 and not 0 and where it was defined. And sadly, this is one of those things that isn't defined well anywhere other than in the MT2 revision. It's just kind of been a standard practice in the industry. Everyone has always used the 0.00, but it's not like it's in the Code of Federal Regulations. So I like to point out that it is at least documented somewhere within FEMA's programs that it is 0.00 foot. We have created guidance for completing a no-rise analysis, and it contains information that might be helpful to floodplain administrators, especially those that don't see these that often. It will have a list of things that you should be expecting to see. We probably are due to update that, especially now that we have a lot more 2D modeling going on. So there are going to be some things that are a little bit different. But that is a resource that's available on our website. I think Michelle was going to throw it in the chat for you, so you can get to it if you need it. Okay, so per 44 CFR 65.12, the developer or community must submit for and receive the approval for the conditional letter of map revision prior to any activity occurring if the modeling shows any increase in base flood elevations, a change in the floodway delineation or the encroachment stations within the model. So that might not make sense to anyone that's not in the model and knows how the floodway is defined within the model itself. But basically, anything that changes where the boundary of the floodway is in the model, that would then be a change on the firm panel, the flood insurance rate map panel, would require a conditional letter of map change and then a letter of map change after construction. And then a change in hydrology. And this is really important to talk through when we are discussing 2D modeling versus 1D. 1D modeling used steady state and static flows. And a lot of our 2D models are going to use unsteady state that allows for some fluctuation in the flows that are being reported. So when you're doing a no rise in a 1D regulatory area, but using a 2D model, you will have to compare to make sure that the hydrology is not changing by much. And the definition would be not statistically significant, but you'll have to look into the details of the study itself to know what statistically significant is going to mean for your area, because it's going to look different depending on how the hydrology was developed to begin with. Okay, so in 44 CFR 65.7 C2I, if a floodway change is proposed, you have to use the original hydraulic computer model that was developed to determine the base flood elevations that are published on the flood insurance rate map. And again, I include this because the first time I gave this presentation, someone also asked me that question, and I was not prepared for it at all because I'd never even thought of the fact that it made sense to anyone to use something other than the model that was developed for the firm panel. Now, there are situations where the original model doesn't exist or it's in an old format that is only in a paper format or a PDF that then has to be transferred into HECRAS. And there are instances where some of those original models have been lost. If that is the case, you can rebuild a model as best as you can using current modeling standards. So it would be HEC-RAS, and then you would have to match your cross-section locations, your elevations within half a foot, and you would rebuild that model to then determine whether you're meeting no rise and going through the different modeling steps. So it is always easiest to use the model if FEMA has it or if our office has it. We get a lot of requests for regulatory models, and we will provide that to anyone that reaches out if we have it. But know that we don't always know if they're the regulatory models, so we will send it out with a caveat that you still need to check to make sure that the base flood elevations, floodway elevations are matching, so that you're not stuck in a situation where you submit for the permit and then find out that you were not using the regulatory model. But these have to be calibrated to reproduce that original profile, simply because if you're not using something that is matching or close to matching the existing regulatory data, the existing firm panel, then you're not starting from the base of what you're supposed to be comparing to. And I get that that's really frustrating because we have a lot of old maps in Nebraska and a lot of HEC 2 models yet. So they're really difficult to work with, difficult to update, difficult to go through this process. If anyone's going to NEPSMA, I'll be giving a wonderful presentation on the importance of map changes for those of you who do any development in the floodplain or floodway, so that we can talk through the map maintenance piece of this. But we do have a lot of old data that has not been replaced. So just make sure that if you have questions as you're getting into the modeling, or if you're on the Platte River that has ice affected modeling, our agency can help answer questions through the technical assistance that we can provide to communities. So feel free to reach out whenever. Okay, requirements of a no-rise. Okay, I just showed you the definition in CFR, that the analysis has to be based on the effective information because that's what's reflected on your firm panels. It has to be supported by technical data or an explanation of why you didn't need to do a hydraulic analysis. And again, paint striping, or if you're doing, for the DOT people on the phone, mill fill, where you're for sure not changing anything in the floodway. Those are pretty easy to explain, but do make sure that it's in a way that is understandable for the person who's going to be reviewing it. And then if there's draft data available in the area, it can only be used if it's more restrictive than the effective information. And in our state, we do have a number of counties that are in preliminary phase, moving through that regulatory process. And if there is a map that's at prelim or even LFD, you would have to use both to make sure that your project is going to meet the requirements for the regulatory data today to get your project permitted, knowing that construction might not be done until that preliminary map is effective. You would want to make sure that you're then not causing an issue on that future regulatory data because you know that it's on the path to become regulatory data. All right, now we're going to jump into the differences in modeling methods, because this is important when we're looking at no-rise analyses for 2D modeling versus 1D. So in the 1D modeling world, if this is your watershed, you would cut cross sections along each of those different streams, and they would be cut roughly perpendicular to flow. They would hopefully be in representative areas, and then the data in between is interpolated, but you set a known flow value. So this is event-based only, and that set flow value stays the same. So every cross section is going to see the same amount of water, but that cross section will also have just one flood elevation. There's not going to be any difference from one side to the other. And if anyone has ever been out to a bridge or a river that's flooding, you will know that that is pretty unrealistic for what happens in real life. So in 2D modeling, this is where river flood flows and precipitation can be used. We can use what they're calling a rain on grid with some information from NOAA. The terrain is represented by a grid with cell sizes of 200 feet by 200 feet or smaller based on FEMA guidance. And we're no longer interpolating between cross sections, but between cells. So we have a data point every roughly 200 feet within this model, and that is not the case in a 1D model. And it's also going to, in a 1D model, FEMA wants anything that's got a drainage area of more than 1 square mile modeled. The 2D model is going to pick up any small drainage. So it's going to show areas that are less than 1 square mile. It's going to show the effects of that rainfall. So we'll have the pluvial and fluvial flooding. So it'll look a lot different on a map. And in fact, in the 2D models that we do at the watershed level, it can show floodplain almost everywhere. So you have to do a little bit of cleanup to get realistic results. Okay, 1D model, again, it's one directional flow. You get an elevation. You're trying to cut those cross sections perpendicular to the flow so that you're getting something that's representative of the floodplain. There's no defined time for the hydrology simulation. It's just a set flow. It's computed at all of the cross sections, and it'll run through the iterations until it gets within an allowable tolerance. It's typically steady state, so the flows only change when we actually force the model to change that flow at a flow change location. And then the results are only reported at cross sections, and then they're interpolated in between, which tends to be most of the area. So it's just going to take the elevation of one cross section, the elevation of the downstream cross section, and it's just going to do a straight interpolation along the flow line between the two. So it's not as realistic as what happens in the real world, but it was better than not having anything back when we started using 1D modeling. And then the floodway is defined using encroachment stations. They're entered at each cross section, but that floodway boundary can be interpolated in between. So it can get wider or narrower because it's not an actual calculation. In the cross section image that's shown on the upper right, the black line that comes in is the encroachment station. So the blue line that connects that is your floodway elevation. And that's a good representation of how the floodway is not a natural or topographic feature. So that's not something that it's intersecting ground. It's just that the encroachment came in. So if you were to fill in those areas underneath that black line, you would be increasing the water surface elevation by a foot or less. 2D modeling utilizes a mesh grid with computation results in each cell. It allows for multi-directional flow, unsteady flow. It freely flows from one area to adjacent areas within the modeled area. It's especially useful in broad, shallow floodplains. You won't see as much of a difference from 1D to 2D if you're in a really steep sloped, channelized area. So like if you were in the mountains in Colorado, 2D modeling isn't going to show you much difference than what the 1D model is. But if you're on the Platte River, it sure is going to make a difference. The hydrology is defined according to the storm event. So still the 1% annual chance, the same recurrence intervals that we were using before, but now we're using rainfall data and duration. So we typically use a 24-hour storm, and that's what defines the simulation time. The results are computed for each grid throughout the project, which allows for less interpolation between to get the results. A 2D modeled floodway, they're no longer developed at cross sections like they were in 1D, and there's less interpolation between. So you're just going to have interpolation between those 200 by 200 foot cells or smaller. But the downside of this is because it has more data in it, it is also more sensitive to minor changes within the floodway. So achieving a no rise is typically going to be a little bit more challenging. The 2D floodway is defined using a depth times velocity uh, raster that we create in HECRAS. And whereas a 1D model wants your floodway surcharges to always be between 0 and 1 foot, and you can't deviate from that at all. A 2D floodway, because of the difference in calculations, allows negative surcharges. So it can be negative 0.5 feet to 1.5 feet, anywhere within the extent of the floodway when you compare the base flood elevation to the floodway elevation. But then you have to look through the entire modeled area to make sure that your surcharges are between that 0 and 1 foot at any insurable structure. And that's to make sure that we're following the same rules for homeowners if we're in 1D or 2D. So it still meets the requirement that's defined in the different regulations. So now we are going to get into the actual no-rise analysis. So on a 2D study flood insurance rate map, it's going to look a little bit different than they did in the 1D world. You will still have base flood elevations. You're still going to have a profile baseline or stream centerline. But then instead of cross sections, you will have evaluation lines, and they are not going to be straight across like the base flood elevation lines were before. They're going to move around a little bit and be kind of squiggly lines because they're following the change in water surface elevation from those different cells, which does more realistically represent what happens in real life. It's still not perfect, but it's much closer than our 1D models were. So even though you have the evaluation lines, that's where they're going to report the base flood elevation. These will also then be lettered so that they can be included in the floodway data table, similar to how the cross sections were in a 1D study. And then the placement is intended to occur when there is a pretty consistent profile slope between the two evaluation lines, so that that can assist with BFE interpolation, similar to how it was done in 1D studies. A big change for a 2D study area is that there will no longer be a profile that's published in the flood insurance study. So many of you have probably been trained to go into the profiles to do that BFE interpolation to figure out what your elevation is at the project area. You'll no longer be able to do that. It'll have to be done from the firm panel. And the floodway, to know if you're in an area that has 2D data versus 1D data, the floodway data table will contain new footnotes that let you know that the floodway was computed by two-dimensional modeling and that the values were reported based on averages calculated at the evaluation lines. So FEMA allows for surcharge averaging along those evaluation lines, and that's the same thing that's happening in a 1D cross section. It's just that it looks a little bit different in 2D because the line isn't straight, and it's just a different way of calculating, but you're still going to average your surcharge value along that line to report in the floodway data table. You have to ensure that no insurable structures are impacted by the proposed project. We would want to do that in any project anyway. There's not a single source for insurable structures though, and that can make that piece a little bit challenging. There's a Microsoft building footprints layer. There's a core national structure inventory. FEMA has a layer, but they all have some differences. They all have some issues with them. So do the best that you can, use a building footprint layer. And then we use aerial imagery a lot. We honestly have gone to assessor sites to look at the photos of the properties to see, because sometimes it'll look like it's a building, but when you actually get down on the ground and look at photos of it, it maybe doesn't have walls. It's maybe just like a shelter or something like that. So use the resources that you have. to do the best that you can to determine whether or not a structure, an insurable structure, is impacted. A 2D model no-rise analyses, very similar to, not very similar, exactly like a 1D analyses, would require that any previous projects were included. So if there hadn't been a map change to incorporate development because those projects met no-rise or they were in the flood fringe, you would have to develop that model, including those projects, to make sure that you're starting from a baseline condition of what's actually on the ground. And in a 2D area, those cumulative impacts from multiple projects are likely going to be problematic for a no-rise status for particular projects, just because there's so much less interpolation that's going on, and 2D models just inherently are more sensitive to any changes that are made to them. Feel free to follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X. If you have questions, always feel free to reach out to any of our staff that are here to help with the NFIP compliance side of things. Of course, we have Elijah, our state NFIP coordinator, and then Erin, Anna, Mercy, Isabella are all outreach, and they're doing our FEMA audits and working with communities every day. Michelle is the one that keeps us all sane. And you can always reach out to me with any of the engineering questions. And if I am unable to answer it, we have a team of professionals here that can help answer any questions or do reviews and whatnot for you.